"You call that medium rare?" The guy sneered, sending his steak back. Clara Ara bit back a retort. Another night, another entitled jackass. But this wasn't just about burnt meat. 50 million hung in the balance. The CEO, some chic fellow, watched it all. Quiet. He sees more than they think. They believe she's just a waitress. Invisible. Another replaceable cog. Big mistake. He's about to spring his trap, a question nobody can answer. Except Clara Ara. A question that'll expose their arrogance. A little Arabic. A whole lot of karma. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The Gilded Spoon wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night the same play was performed, the quiet differential dance of the service staff around the loud self-important patrons. Clara Ara Hayes was one of the dancers, and she knew her steps by heart. Tie the silk apron strings just so ensure the pen in her pocket didn't leak, and most importantly, perfect the art of being present but invisible. For the past 2 years, this had been her world, a world of clinking glasses, hushed negotiations, and the lingering scent of truffle oil and ambition. Tonight, however, the air was different. It was electric taut with a specific kind of tension reserved for the truly powerful. The entire top floor had been booked for a private dinner hosted by Sterling Thorne Enterprises, one of the city's most aggressive investment firms. Their target, their guest of honor, was Sheikh Darmian Al-Sakra, the elusive CEO of Al-Sak Global, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms across the world. He was in town for 72 hours, and in that time, Sterling Thorne's CEO, Richard Abernathy, intended to secure a partnership that would redefine the city's skyline. Clara Ara felt the pressure ripple through the staff. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named Julian, had repeated his instructions a dozen times. Perfection is the only acceptable standard tonight. Mr. Abernathy is not a forgiving man, and his guest, well, let's just say his guest is on another level entirely. For Clara Ara, perfection was muscle memory. She arranged the polished silverware, her fingers tracing the heavy, ornate patterns. Each fork, each knife was a small, cold reminder of the life she was supposed to have. 4 years ago, she wasn't Clara Ara the waitress. She was Clara Ara Hayes, a top student at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, fluent in 3 languages with a specialization in Middle Eastern economic policy. She had a full scholarship and a future so bright it felt tangible, a warm light at the end of a long tunnel of hard work. Then the phone call came. Her mother, her only family, had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer. The scholarship covered tuition, not life. The treatments, the round-the-clock care, the mortgage on their small suburban house, it all fell on Clara Ara's 20-year-old shoulders. She dropped out, trading textbooks for medical bills and lecture halls for the sterile, quiet waiting rooms of an oncology ward. Her mother had fought for a year and a half before passing away, leaving Clara Ara with a mountain of debt and a hollowed-out heart. The Gilded Spoon, with its decent tips and flexible hours, was meant to be a temporary stop, a place to catch her breath. But 2 years had passed and the weight of her obligations kept her anchored here, serving men like Richard Abernathy, men whose world she once aspired to join, not serve. Hayes Table 5 needs water now. Julian's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. She nodded, her expression placid, betraying none of the bitter irony that churned inside her. As she picked up the heavy water pitcher, she glanced at her reflection in the polished glass of the wine cellar door. She saw a tired-looking young woman in a starched black uniform, her light brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. The spark that used to be in her hazel eyes was muted, dimmed by exhaustion and the relentless grind of just getting by. Tonight's dinner was a big deal, and the tips would be substantial. That was all that mattered. The money would go towards the final payment on her mother's medical debt, a symbolic milestone she desperately needed to reach. The Sterling Thorne executives began to arrive, a parade of identical dark suits and confident, booming voices. Richard Abernathy led them, a man in his late 50s with a fid face and an air of entitlement that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He surveyed the setup with a critical eye, his gaze sweeping past Clara Ara as if she were a lamppost. "Everything better be flawless, Julian," Abernathy said, not as a request, but as a command. Sheikh al-Sakar is accustomed to the best. I will not have this deal jeopardized by a lukewarm soup or a clumsy waiter. Of course, Mr. Anathi, my best team is on it, Julian replied, his voice a study in practiced subservience. Clara Ara felt a familiar knot of resentment tighten in her stomach. It wasn't the work she hated, but the dismissal, the casual dehumanization that came with it. To these men, she was not a person with a past or a mind of her own. She was a pair of hands there to pour wine and clear plates. She took a deep breath, pushing her feelings down into the deep, quiet place where she kept all the other things she couldn't afford to feel. Tonight was just another performance. She would play her part, smile her polite, empty smile, and count her tips at the end of the night. She had no idea that this particular performance would have a different audience, and that one man was about to see right through the uniform to the woman beneath. The arrival of Sheikh Darmian al-Sekr was not announced with a flurry of activity, but with a sudden, palpable shift in the room's energy. The loud chatter of Abernathy's team dwindled to a respectful hush. The doors to the private dining room swished open, and he entered. He was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, and moved with a quiet, coiled grace that was far more intimidating than Abernathy's bluster. He wore a bespoke Western suit of the finest charcoal gray, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him. His features were sharp and intelligent, his dark eyes missing nothing. He was followed by two aides who remained by the door alert and silent. Damien's gaze swept the room once a comprehensive analytical scan that took in the opulent decor, the nervous faces of the Sterling Thorne executives, and for a fleeting moment, Clara, who stood poised and still by the service station. Unlike the others, his eyes didn't slide past her. They registered her presence, a brief neutral acknowledgement, before he turned his attention to his host. Mr. Abernathy Damien, said, his voice a low, smooth baritone with a faint, unplaceable accent. Thank you for your hospitality, Sheikh Als boomed, stepping forward to shake his hand with a bit too much enthusiasm. Please allow me to introduce my team. This is Mark Renshaw, my senior vice president, and Paul Fincher, our head of acquisitions. Mark and Paul, two younger clones of Abernathy, stepped forward, offering practiced smiles and firm handshakes. Their eyes, however, betrayed a mix of greed and anxiety. They looked at Damien like starving wolves, sizing up a lion, aware of the prize, but terrified of its power. Clara Ara began her duties moving silently around the table to fill water glasses. Her proximity gave her a front-row seat to the unfolding dynamic. She was an expert in reading people, a skill honed by years of depending on tips, and she could already see the cracks in Sterling Thorne's facade of confidence. Anathy was a peacock, puffing out his chest and launching into a monologue about his company's recent successes. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes, while his subordinates nodded in sycophantic agreement. Mark Renshaw, in an attempt to seem relatable, kept trying to steer the conversation toward trivial topics like sports and local real estate subjects that clearly held no interest for their guest. Damien remained a calm, immovable center in their storm of sycophancy. He listened more than he spoke, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed but radiating an aura of absolute control. He would not offer a brief non-committal, "I see," or ask a pointed question that would send Abernathy scrambling for a smooth answer, as Clara served the first course, a delicate seared scallop appetizer. Mark Renaud clicked his fingers in her direction without looking at her. "Girl, another bottle of the Chardonnay and be quick about it." The word girl landed like a small sharp stone in Clara Ara's chest. She kept her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. "Of course, sir," she murmured, turning to retrieve the wine. From across the table, she saw Damien's eyes flicker toward Mark, a subtle, almost imperceptible narrowing of his gaze. It was there for a second and then gone. But Clara Ara saw it. He had noticed. He noticed everything. The dinner continued in the same vein. Abernathy and his team laid out their proposal for a joint venture to develop a massive downtown commercial complex. They spoke of profit margins, market shares, and synergistic growth. It was the language Clara Ara had once been fluent in, the very subject of her unfinished thesis. As she poured wine and cleared plates, she found herself mentally dissecting their pitch. identifying its weaknesses, the overly optimistic projections, the glossed-over risk factors. They were so focused on flattering Damien that they were failing to present a truly sound case. Their condescension towards the staff was a constant undercurrent. Paul Fincher sent back his steak, claiming it was medium rare instead of medium a complaint. So baseless, it was clearly just a petty display of power. Abnathi loudly complained that the service was slow, despite Clara Ara and her colleague moving with near telepathic efficiency. Through it all, Damien remained quiet. He ate little, watching the men around him with the patient focus of a predator. He observed how they treated each other, how they treated the staff, and how they presented their business. To Abernathy, this was a dinner. To Damien, it was a test, and they were all failing. Clara Ara felt a strange sense of detachment. She was a ghost in the room, privy to the inner workings of a deal that could change the city, yet completely removed from it. She watched Mark Renshaw spill a drop of wine on the tablecloth and glare at her as if it were her fault. She listened to Abernathy make a culturally insensitive joke about the Middle East, which was met with a stony silence from Damien. She knew then that the deal was dead. These men were arrogant, sloppy, and disrespectful. They saw Damien's wealth, but they didn't see the man. They didn't understand that for a person of his caliber, business was not just about numbers on a page. It was about character, respect, and vision. As she cleared the main course plates, her hand brushed against the corner of a portfolio left on an empty chair. It was Abernathy's presentation. For a wild, reckless moment, she imagined opening it, reading the fine print, and seeing the flaws she had already predicted. She quickly quelled the urge. That was a different Clara, a girl from a different life. The main course was finished, and the air grew thick with anticipation. This was the moment Anathy would push for a commitment. He cleared his throat, a self-satisfied smile on his face, ready to close the deal. But Damien held up a hand, a simple gesture that commanded immediate silence. He looked around the table, his dark eyes finally losing their neutral mask and taking on a sharp, penetrating intensity. "You have spoken at length about synergy." Damien said, his voice quiet yet carrying to every corner of the room. "A simple concept yet difficult to achieve. It requires a deep and shared understanding." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Anathy. Then his next words changed everything. He switched from perfect, unaccented English to fluent classical Arabic. The language flowed from him, complex and elegant, as he posed a long, intricate question to the stunned men at the table. The switch in language was as abrupt and shocking as a sudden plunge into ice water. One moment the conversation was a predictable river of corporate English. The next it was a torrent of unfamiliar sounds, deep guttural consonants and flowing vowels that filled the room with an ancient poetic authority. Richard Abernathy's confident smile froze on his face, melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted around the table, as if searching for a translator who might magically appear. Mark Renault's jaw went slack, and Paul Fincher's face turned a blotchy, anxious red. They were completely and utterly lost. Damien Al-Sakar didn't just ask a simple question. It was a multi-layered inquiry, a complex business hypothetical wrapped in the rich, formal syntax of classical Arabic. Clara Ara, standing near the service station with a tray of empty glasses, understood every single word. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was asking about the potential for cultural and logistical friction in a joint U.S. Emirati venture. He wasn't just asking if they foresaw problems. He was asking for a detailed strategic framework to mitigate the clash between a Western, quarterly report-driven business model and a Middle Eastern one based on long-term relationships and trust. It was a brilliant, incisive question, the kind of question that cut through all the superficial flattery and demanded true expertise. It was the exact topic of a paper she'd written in her third year at Georgetown, a paper that had earned her a personal commendation from the dean. The silence that followed Damien's question was no longer just a pause in conversation. It was a vacuum growing heavier and more suffocating with each passing second. It was the sound of a $50 million deal evaporating into thin air. Abernathy was the first to break, letting out a choked, nervous laugh. A Sheikh, an excellent joke. "My Arabic is, I'm afraid, a little rusty. Limited to hello and thank you, I'm ashamed to say." He looked to his colleagues for support, but they were just as helpless. Mark Renshaw fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he tried to open a translation app. Just a moment. Sheikh, I can run that through. The desperation in his voice was pathetic. Damien watched them, his expression a cold, hard mask of disappointment. He didn't even glance at the phone. He simply waited, letting their incompetence hang in the air like a foul odor. He had given them a test, and they had failed spectacularly. It wasn't just about language. It was about preparation, about respect. They had come to a meeting with one of the most powerful men from the Arab world without bothering to learn a single thing about his culture or his way of doing business. They had assumed their money and their swagger would be enough. "I am not joking, Mr. Anathy," Damien said, switching back to English. His voice was quiet, but it had a new razor-sharp edge. "I'm asking about the fundamental principles of our potential partnership. If you cannot even comprehend the question, how can you possibly be trusted to help build the answer?" The rebuke was devastating. A direct hit that left Anathy sputtering. "Well, we have teams for that. Specialists, translators. It's a matter of logistics, not a reflection of our commitment." "Commitment," Damien repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it for the first time and finding it sour. "Commitment begins with understanding. It appears you have none." Clara Ara stood frozen by the wall, the heavy tray in her hands the only thing grounding her. This was it. The deal was collapsing. The humiliation in the room was so thick she could feel it in her own throat. She watched the men squirm, their arrogance stripped away to reveal the terrified, inadequate executives beneath. A part of her felt a grim satisfaction. They were getting what they deserved for their condescension, for their dismissal of everyone they deemed beneath them. But another part of her, the student, the analyst, the woman who had spent years studying this very subject, felt an overwhelming urge to speak. The answer to his question was right there on the tip of her tongue. The frameworks, the case studies, the mitigation strategies, it was all there, perfectly preserved in her memory. "Say nothing." A voice in her head screamed, "This is not your world. You are the waitress. You pour the water. You clear the plates. Getting involved is career suicide." Her manager, Julian, was watching from the doorway, his face pale with horror. If she spoke, she would be fired on the spot. Abernathy would see to it personally. She would lose the one thing that was keeping a roof over her head, the one thing allowing her to chip away at the crushing mountain of debt. But then she looked at Darmian Al-Sakra. He wasn't just a rich businessman testing his partners. She saw something else in his eyes, a deep, profound frustration. He was a visionary looking for a true partner, and all he had found were hollow men. He was searching for a flicker of understanding, a single sign that someone in this room was operating on his level. His impossible question hung in the air unanswered. The silence stretched, becoming an indictment of everyone at the table. Clara Ara's training, her education, her entire past life collided with her present reality. For 2 years, she had been invisible. For 2 years, she had silenced the brightest parts of herself to survive. And in that moment, she couldn't bear it for a second longer. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was filled with the frantic, unspoken thoughts of failing men. Abernath's mind raced, cycling through a Rolodex of excuses and deflections. How could he salvage this? He could blame the recruiters for not providing a cultural brief, blame his assistants for not hiring a live translator. He could try to pivot to steer the conversation back to the solid, comfortable ground of financial projections. But he knew it was too late. The Sheikh's eyes, dark and unyielding, told him the damage was done. The look on Damien Al-Sakra's face wasn't anger. It was a calm, surgical dismissal. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was simply observing the final pathetic squirming of his prey. Mark Renshaw had given up on his translation app. He stared at his phone's blank screen as if it had personally betrayed him. He had spent weeks preparing for this dinner, memorizing every line of their pitch, practicing his handshake, even buying a new $2,000 tie. It had all been for nothing. He had been undone by a few sentences in a language he'd never considered important. He felt a surge of resentment, not at his own ignorance, but at the Sheikh for setting such an unfair, unexpected trap. Paul Fincher just wished the floor would open up and swallow him. He avoided looking at Anathy, whose face was now a dangerous shade of crimson. He could already feel the professional fallout from this disaster. There would be no promotions, no celebratory bonuses. There would be a grim meeting tomorrow morning where blame would be assigned, and he knew it always rolled downhill. The seconds ticked by, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of the $50 million deal. The two aides by the door stood motionless, their faces impassive, but Clara Ara could sense their shared contempt for the Sterling Thorn team. This was not the first time they had witnessed their boss deploy this tactic, and it was clear they had never seen it fail to expose a weakness. Clara Ara's own internal battle was reaching its climax. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to stay silent, to blend into the wallpaper. She had bills to pay. She had worked too hard to climb out of the financial crater her mother's illness had left. Being fired from a high-end restaurant like the Gilded Spoon for insubordination would be a black mark on her record, making it hard to find another job that paid as well. It was a stupid, insane risk. They don't deserve your help, the bitter voice inside her argued. They treated you like dirt. Let them fail. But the other voice, the voice of the scholar she used to be, was just as loud. It was a voice that yearned for intellectual engagement, that despised seeing ignorance rewarded and expertise lie dormant. The question Damien had asked was not just a test. It was a beautiful, complex problem, and she knew the answer. To stay silent felt like a betrayal of everything she had once worked for, a final surrender to the circumstances that had stolen her future. She looked at Abhinath's furious, helpless face, at Mark Renshaw's pathetic fumbling, and she felt not pity, but a profound sense of waste, the waste of an opportunity, the waste of a potentially transformative project for the city, all because of arrogance and cultural myopia. Then her eyes met Damien's again. He was about to speak, to formally end the charade and walk away. His mouth had just begun to form a word. In that split second, Clara Ara made her choice. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of being less than she was. Taking a small, steadying breath, she set the tray of glasses down on the service stand with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was tiny, but in the oppressive silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head in the room snapped in her direction. Abhinathi, Mark, and Paul stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and annoyance. Who was this waitress to interrupt such a high-stakes moment? Julian from the doorway looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Clara Ara ignored them all. Her focus was entirely on Sheikh Darmian al-Sakur. She met his gaze directly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But her posture was straight, her expression composed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, terrifying resolve. The deafening silence had been broken by the simple sound of a tray being set down. Now she would shatter it completely with her voice. With the eyes of every person in the room fixed on her, Clara Ara took a single step forward, away from the shadows of the service station and into the soft light above the dining table. She inclined her head respectfully toward Sheikh Damien. Then she spoke. The words that came out of her mouth were not English. They were the same classical, eloquent Arabic that Damien had used. Her pronunciation was flawless, her cadence measured and confident. She didn't just translate his question, she acknowledged its complexity before beginning her answer. Your question touches upon the very heart of international partnership, a challenge that transcends mere financial modeling. She began in Arabic, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the stunned silence. Abhinathi's jaw, which had been merely slack, now dropped open completely. Mark Renshaw looked back and forth between Clara Ara and Damien, as if he were watching a tennis match played with invisible balls. Julian, the manager, clutched the door frame for support, his face ashen. He was witnessing the most spectacular act of professional self-destruction he had ever seen. Clara Ara paid them no mind. She was no longer Clara Ara the waitress. She was Clara Ara Hayes of Georgetown, presenting her analysis. The primary friction, she continued, her gaze locked with Damien's, is not logistical, but philosophical. Western firms are often structured around short-term quantifiable metrics for shareholder satisfaction. In contrast, many Gulf-based enterprises like Alsacra Global are built on a foundation of long-term vision, legacy, and interpersonal trust. A successful synergy requires a hybrid governance model. She saw a flicker of something in Damien's eyes. Not just surprise, but genuine focused interest. He leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his entire attention now centered on her. She went on outlining a three-pronged strategy. She spoke of establishing a joint oversight committee with equal representation, but with rotating chairmanships to balance power dynamics. She suggested that initial project milestones should be based not on profit, but on the successful integration of operational teams and the establishment of shared cultural protocols. She even quoted a line from the Arab poet al-Mutanabi about the strength of deep roots, weaving it seamlessly into her business argument. You cannot simply import a Western corporate structure and expect it to flourish, she explained. You must cultivate a new one from the ground up, one that respects the patience and relationship-based approach of one partner while leveraging the agile data-driven methods of the other. It is not about compromise where both Missum did lose something. It is about synthesis where a stronger third way is created. Her answer was concise yet comprehensive, theoretical yet practical. It was an answer born not from a quick Google search or a translation app, but from years of dedicated study and deep critical thought. It was in every respect the perfect answer. When she finished, a new kind of silence fell over the room. It was not the heavy, awkward silence of before. This was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. The Sterling Thorne executives stared at her as if she had just sprouted wings. They hadn't just been upstaged. They had been rendered completely and utterly irrelevant by their waitress. Clara Ara's heart was still pounding, the adrenaline of her reckless act coursing through her veins. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, and now she braced for the consequences. She expected Abernathy to explode in a fit of rage to have her thrown out. But Abernathy was speechless, his face a kaleidoscope of confusion, fury, and humiliation. He looked at Clara Ara, then at Damien, his mind unable to process what had just happened. Damien al-Sakkar was the first to speak. He didn't look at Abernathy or his team. His dark, intelligent eyes were still fixed on Clara Ara. He spoke in English now, his voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable weight of command. You have an unexpected expertise in this matter. It wasn't a question. It was an observation laden with curiosity. Before Clara Ara could respond, Abernathy found his voice. It was a strangled, furious rasp. What is the meaning of this? He snarled, directing his anger not at Damien, but at the easiest target. Who do you think you are? You're the help. You're fired, Julian. Get her out of my sight. Get her out of here now. Julian started to move forward, his face a mask of professional panic. Clara Ara stood her ground, her chin held high. She had known this was coming, but she didn't get a chance to move. She will stay, Damien said. The two words were spoken quietly, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. Abernathy Julian. Everyone froze. Damien al-Sakkar turned his head slowly, fixing Richard Abernathy with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. This dinner, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level, is over. Please show my associates out. I wish to speak with Ms. He paused, looking at Clara Ara, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Hayes, Clara Ara supplied her voice, barely a whisper. Clara Ara, Hayes. I wish to speak with Ms. Hayes. Damien repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. Alone. The dismissal was brutal in its efficiency. Sheikh Damien al-Sakkar didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply gestured toward the door, a silent command that his two aides immediately understood. They stepped forward, their presence suddenly far more imposing, and politely but firmly ushered the Sterling Thorne executives out of the room. Richard Abernathy's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The humiliation of being dismissed from his own dinner was wearing with the fury of being undermined by a waitress. He shot Clara Ara a look of pure venom, a silent promise of retribution that made her stomach clench. But he didn't dare argue with the sheikh. With a final choked sound of indignation, he turned and stalked out of the room, his two vice presidents trailing behind him like scolded dogs. Julian, the manager, lingered by the doorway, wringing his hands. Sheikh al-Sakkar, my sincerest apologies. I can assure you this breach of protocol is unprecedented. The employee will be dealt with. You are dismissed as well. Damien cut in his voice, calm but absolute. Julian's mouth snapped shut. He gave Clara Ara one last bewildered look before scurrying away, leaving the vast dining room in an unnerving quiet. Now it was just the two of them, the Sheikh and the waitress. The immense table laden with the remains of an abandoned desert course sat between them like a battlefield after the fighting had stopped. The air hummed with unspoken questions. Clara Ara's adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She had won the battle, but had she just lost the war? Her job was gone, and Abernathy was a powerful man with a long memory. Damien rose from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked around the table, not stopping until he stood just a few feet from her. He was taller than she'd realized, and his presence was even more commanding without the buffer of the other executives. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face, trying to reconcile the woman in the server's uniform with the brilliant analyst who had just dismantled a complex geopolitical business problem. "Clara Hayes," he said, tasting the name. "You are without a doubt the most overqualified waitress I have ever met." Clara managed a small wry smile, though her hands were trembling slightly. "It wasn't on my resume." "I should imagine not," he replied, a hint of amusement in his own voice. "Georgetown, was it not? School of Foreign Service. Professor Albright's seminar on international economic policy, perhaps. Your argument about hybrid governance models was a central theme of her 2019 treatise." Clara Ara's composure finally cracked. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. You know her work. I funded the research grant for it," Damien said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I believe true success is built on understanding Ms. Hayes, something Mr. Abernathy and his associates failed to grasp. They came prepared to flatter me. You came prepared to enlighten me." The compliment left her speechless. For years, her knowledge had been a secret, a source of quiet grief for a life she had lost. To have it recognized, to have someone see past the apron and the name tag to the mind beneath, was overwhelming. "I didn't mean to overstep," she said, her voice quiet. "They were failing, and the project, the idea behind it, is important for the city." "You did not overstep," Damien corrected her gently. "You stepped in. There is a significant difference. Now tell me, why are you here serving overpriced steak to men you could intellectually run circles around when you should be in a boardroom or a lecture hall?" Clara Ara hesitated. The story was personal, painful, and she wasn't used to sharing it. But looking at Damien, she didn't see a billionaire CEO or a sheikh. She saw a man of intense curiosity, and she suspected profound integrity. He hadn't just tested Abernathy. He had been searching for something, and for some reason he believed he had found it in her. He deserved the truth. Taking a deep breath, she told him everything. She spoke of her scholarship to Georgetown, her passion for her studies, her dreams of working in diplomacy or international development. Then she told him about the phone call, her mother's diagnosis, and the impossible choice she had to make. She described the grueling years of balancing part-time jobs with hospital visits, the crushing weight of medical debt that grew with every new treatment, every failed hope. She spoke of her mother's passing with a quiet dignity that hid the deep well of grief still inside her. When she was gone, the debt remained, Clara concluded, her voice thick with emotion. The degree was incomplete, and the loans were coming due. This job, it was supposed to be temporary, a way to stay afloat. But the debt was bigger than I was. Damien listened to her story without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. He had seen wealth and poverty, ambition and despair all over the world. But there was a quiet strength in Clara Ara's story that resonated with him. She hadn't been defeated by her circumstances. She had merely been contained by them. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, processing it all. "In my culture," he said finally, his voice soft, "we believe that adversity does not build character. It reveals it. Your character, Miss Hayes, is formidable." He walked over to the window, looking out at the glittering city skyline below. "Abernathy's project is flawed," he said, more to himself than to her. "His numbers are inflated, and his vision is short-sighted. He wants to build a monument to himself. I want to build a legacy for the city." He turned back to face her. "But the potential, as you said, is real." It just needs the right leadership. It needs someone who understands that a foundation of trust is more valuable than one of concrete. Clara Ara's heart began to beat faster as she started to understand where he was going. The idea was so audacious, so impossible that she barely dared to entertain it. Abernathy assumed I was here to be a silent partner, a walking bank account. Damien continued, a sharp edge returning to his voice. He was mistaken. I came here to find a leader for this project on my side of the table, a CEO for Alsac Global's North American operations. I had a feeling I would not find that person at his dinner table. He paused, his gaze intense. It seems my feeling was correct. He took a step closer, his eyes locking with hers. The test was not for him. Miss Hayes, not really. It was a net cast into a wide room to see what I might catch. I was looking for intelligence, integrity, and courage. I have found all three. The unraveling was complete, not of the deal, but of her entire life. In the space of an hour, she had gone from a disgraced, unemployed waitress to what she didn't even know. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was struggling to find her balance. Clara Ara stared at Damien, her mind a maelstrom of chaotic thoughts, unable to anchor itself to the new reality he had just constructed. The word he had spoken, CEO, reverberated in the silent room, sounding less like a job title and more like a term from a foreign language she couldn't comprehend. It was an absurd, impossible notion. Just hours ago, her primary concern was a threadbare seam on her uniform and calculating whether the night's tips would be enough to cover next month's rent and a late utility bill. Now this man, a figure of almost mythical global influence, was offering her the reins of a corporate empire's North American division. CEO. The word escaped her lips as a fragile, breathless whisper, utterly devoid of the authority it was meant to command. She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest and quickly suppressed it. Mr. Al-Sakra, with all due respect, that's insane. I am a waitress. Look at me. She gestured down at her practical non-slip shoes and the simple black uniform, now faintly stained with the evening's labor. My last professional experience involved a library card scanner. I don't have an MBA. I don't even have a finished bachelor's degree. My resume has a 4-year gap filled with this. I am the definition of unqualified. Damien listened patiently, his expression unwavering. He didn't dismiss her objections. He considered them, his dark eyes thoughtful. When she finished, a faint knowing smile touched his lips. Everything you have just said is a fact, Ms. Hayes, but none of it is the truth. The truth is that you stood in a room with a man who could professionally and financially ruin you in front of a team of executives who perceived you as less than human. And you delivered a more insightful, strategic, and culturally nuanced analysis than their entire board could produce in a year. You demonstrated more courage in that single unsolicited act than Richard Abernathy has shown in his entire carefully curated career. You believe a piece of paper, a diploma, is what qualifies a person for leadership. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, his voice lowering with intensity. That piece of paper proves only that you can follow a curriculum. It says nothing of your ability to innovate, to lead under pressure, or to act with integrity when it is costly to do so. Your life, Ms. Hayes, has been your qualification. You have managed crippling debt, navigated the labyrinthian healthcare system, and endured the daily indignities of a service job, all while retaining the sharp analytical mind that was honed at one of the world's finest institutions. That is not a gap on a resume. That is a crucible. It has forged a strength in you that people like Mark Renshaw cannot even begin to comprehend. His words were a powerful counter-narrative to the story of failure she had been telling herself for years. He wasn't just offering a job. He was reframing her entire past, transforming her perceived weaknesses into undeniable strengths. He gestured around the opulent, empty dining room. This world, the world of corporate power, is filled with people who have the right resumes, the right connections, the right degrees. But inside they are hollow. They lack vision, they lack substance, and most of all, they lack character. I have spent my life learning to see past the facade, past the tailored suits and the confident handshakes. I do not look at you and see a waitress. I see a brilliant strategist who understands the crucial intersection of culture and commerce. I see a person of immense integrity who sacrificed her own ambitions for the love of her family. And I see a natural leader who has simply been waiting for an opportunity worthy of her. The conviction in his voice was absolute, leaving no room for argument. He was seeing the person she had once hoped to become, the person she had long since mourned and buried. That dormant self began to stir within her, awakened by the force of his belief in her. What you did tonight was not about showing off your language skills. Damien continued his tone, becoming even more serious. It was an act of profound integrity. You spoke up not for personal gain. Indeed, you risked everything, but because you knew what was right. You valued the potential of the project, the good it could do for this city over your own personal safety. That, Miss Hayes, is the single most important quality I look for in the people I entrust with my family's name and legacy. Everything else, the intricacies of corporate finance, the specific management techniques, the procedural nonsense, all of it can be taught. Character cannot. He walked back to the head of the table, his presence commanding the space effortlessly. From the inner pocket of his perfectly tailored jacket, he produced a heavy, elegant fountain pen and plucked a clean, starched linen napkin from the table setting. With a few swift strokes, he wrote a name and a phone number. "This is Sarah Bradley," he said, holding the napkin out to her. "She is my global chief of operations based in London. She is pragmatic, brilliant, and she will be your primary point of contact. Call her tomorrow morning. She will arrange everything. We will, of course, have my family office settle your outstanding personal debts immediately. Consider it a signing bonus, a symbolic clearing of the slate." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "Your starting salary will be more than sufficient to ensure you never have to worry about such trivialities again." Clara Ara stared at the napkin. The numbers written on it represented a portal to another universe. The casual way he spoke of eliminating her debt, the monstrous, suffocating weight that had dictated every choice she'd made for years, was staggering. It was too much to process. Tears of shock, relief, and sheer terror welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the man in front of her. I don't know what to say," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "Say you'll accept?" Damien urged, his voice softening. "Say you will bring your mind, your character, and your unique perspective to Al Sakra Global. Help me build something meaningful in this city, something that lasts." This was the precipice, the ultimate crossroads she never could have anticipated. One path led back to the familiar shadows of her life, a life of quiet desperation, of being invisible, of being safe but suffocatingly unfulfilled. The other path led into a blindingly bright world of immense pressure, staggering responsibility, and limitless opportunity. It was the most terrifying choice she had ever faced, but the thought of turning back, of putting on the apron tomorrow morning, and pretending this conversation never happened, was infinitely more terrifying. Slowly, as if in a dream, she reached out and took the linen napkin. Her trembling fingers brushed against his, and she felt a jolt of energy, a silent, powerful acknowledgement that passed between them. It was a meeting not just of a potential employer and employee, but of two minds that against all odds recognized something essential in one another. She drew a deep, shuddering breath, the first truly full breath she felt she'd taken in years. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his directly. The tired, defeated waitress was gone. In her place stood the woman he had seen all along. "Okay," she said, her voice finding a new surprising strength. It was clear and unwavering. "Yes, I accept." A genuine, brilliant smile transformed Damien's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and erasing the last traces of his intimidating facade. "Excellent," he responded, the warmth in his voice palpable. "Welcome to AlSac Global CEO Hayes. I expect you in our temporary offices on Thursday morning at 9 mornings. We have much to discuss regarding our new proposal to the city and our now former partners at Sterling Thorne." The implication hung in the air, sharp and delicious. They were not just taking over the project. They were going to build it on the ashes of Abernathy's arrogance. It was a new beginning for her and a final reckoning for the man who had tried to make her feel small. As Damien and his aides departed, leaving her utterly alone in the silent, cavernous room, Clara Ara sank into the nearest plush chair, her legs no longer able to support her. She looked down at the linen napkin clutched in her hand. It was just a piece of paper with a name and a number, but to her it was the key to a future she thought had been permanently locked away. She had walked into the Gilded Spoon that evening as a waitress, a ghost in the machine of other people's lives. She was walking out as its master, her voice finally ready to shape the world. Clara Ara's story is a powerful reminder that we should never judge a person by their uniform or their circumstances. The most brilliant minds and the strongest characters can often be found in the places we least expect. Her courage to speak up, to be seen for who she truly was, didn't just save a deal. It transformed her entire life. It shows us that true value isn't found in a title or a bank account, but in knowledge, integrity, and the bravery to use your voice even when you're terrified. What did you think of Clara Ra's incredible journey? Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to see them triumph? Share your stories in the comments below. If this story inspired you, please hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable real-life dramas.